The slap echoed through the luxury car dealership like a gunshot. Diane Foster, 7 months pregnant, hit the floor. Blood dripped from her lip. Her billionaire husband stood over her, perfectly composed, certain he'd won. But he didn't know the dealership manager was her Army Ranger cousin. He didn't know his dead first wife was still alive. And he certainly didn't know about the 8 women he'd murdered, women whose deaths were about to be avenged. This is the true story of how one public mistake brought down a serial killer hiding behind billion-dollar suits. If you love justice stories where family fights back, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us would you have the courage to wear a wire against a murderer. Let's begin. The security footage would later show everything in brutal clarity. Preston Blackwell's hand moving through the air like a weapon. The impact that snapped Diane Foster's head sideways. Her body crumpling against the gleaming hood of a $70,000 SUV. Blood spattering across pristine white paint. But in that moment, all Diane felt was the explosion of pain across her left cheek and the instinctive terror that he'd hurt the baby. Her hand flew to her 7-month pregnant belly, while her other hand pressed against her burning face. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth where her teeth had cut into her inner lip. Around them, the luxury car dealership had gone completely silent. I said we're buying the Maserati. Preston's voice carried that familiar edge that made Diane's stomach clench with dread. His designer suit remained perfectly pressed despite the violence he'd just unleashed. His silver hair stayed immaculately styled. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he was, a billionaire tech mogul accustomed to getting his way. The SUV's practical interior with its safety ratings and storage space seemed to mock her now. She'd thought maybe, just maybe, she could convince him that their growing family needed something sensible, something normal, something that said they were just regular people preparing for a baby. She should have known better. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." The voice came from across the showroom floor, cutting through the stunned silence. Diane looked up to see a tall man in a navy suit striding toward them. His auburn hair was cut military short. His green eyes blazed with righteous fury. And then recognition hit her like a physical blow. Hank, her cousin Hank, who used to give her piggyback rides at family reunions. Hank, who'd taught her how to change a tire when she was 16. Hank, who'd been like a big brother until Preston had slowly, methodically cut her off from everyone she loved. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Preston stepped toward Hank, using his height and presence the way he always did when someone dared to challenge him. "I could buy this entire dealership with what I spend on lunch." Hank pulled out his phone with practiced efficiency. "Actually, Mr. Blackwell, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is, do you know who you're dealing with?" That's when Diane saw the name tag. Hank Foster, General Manager. Hank, Diane's voice came out as barely a whisper. Hank's expression softened for just a moment as their eyes met. "Hey, Diane, it's going to be okay." He'd never taken his eyes off Preston. "You just assaulted a pregnant woman in my showroom. I'm calling the police." Diane felt a familiar panic rising in her chest. This was exactly the kind of scene Preston hated. The kind of public attention that made him lose control in private later. She could already imagine the consequences. The locked doors, the cut phone lines, the careful bruises that never showed above the neckline of her conservative dresses. "Preston, please," she started, but Hank held up a hand. "No, Diane, don't you dare apologize for his behavior." His phone was already dialing. "Yes, I need to report a domestic violence incident at Premier Motors on 5th Street. The perpetrator is still on scene." Preston's perfectly controlled facade finally cracked. "You have no idea what you've just done," he hissed at Hank. "I will destroy you. I will destroy this place. I will make where you never work in this city again." 2 security guards appeared as if summoned, moving with practiced efficiency toward Preston. He looked around the showroom, perhaps finally realizing how many people had witnessed his loss of control. His expensive lawyers weren't here to clean this up. His usual intimidation tactics weren't working. For once in his carefully controlled life, Preston Blackwell was facing consequences in real time. "This isn't over," he said quietly to Diane, and she felt the familiar chill of his threats settle over her like a shroud. But Hank stepped between them. "Actually, it is. Security will escort you to your car. Any further contact with Diane goes through her attorney." As the guards flanked Preston, He straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket, rebuilding his composed exterior even as his eyes promised retribution. Diane, you'll come home with me now. We'll discuss this privately. For 22 months of marriage, those words would have sent Diane scrambling to obey, to minimize the damage, to somehow make this her fault so Preston's anger would be justified and therefore controllable. But something had changed in the last 5 minutes. Maybe it was seeing Hank again, remembering what it felt like to have someone stand up for her. Maybe it was the shock of having witnesses to Preston's behavior, people who couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence. Maybe it was the protective instinct she felt for the baby growing inside her, the fierce maternal love that had been steadily growing stronger than her fear. No, Diane said quietly. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Preston stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. What did you say? I said no. This time her voice was stronger. I'm not going home with you. 3 hours later, Diane sat in Hank's living room, a bag of frozen peas pressed against her swollen cheek, while her cousin paced the length of his modest home like a caged tiger. I can't believe it's been 2 years, Hank said, running a hand through his short hair. 2 years since you just vanished from family gatherings. We thought you'd gotten too fancy for us once you married a billionaire. Diane's laugh came out bitter. He made it seem so reasonable at first. These people don't understand our lifestyle. Your family makes you anxious. We need our own traditions. Before I knew it, my phone had parental controls. My credit cards were in his name only. My car had a GPS tracker. Classic isolation tactics, came a new voice from the kitchen doorway. Diane looked up to see a woman about her age with kind brown eyes and a professional demeanor. She carried a medical bag. This is my wife, Lauren, Hank said. She's a physician's assistant. I wanted someone to check on you and the baby. Lauren's examination was gentle but thorough. Baby's heartbeat is strong, no signs of placental abruption from the fall. But Diane, you need to be honest with me. Has he hurt you before? Diane hesitated, then nodded. Not hitting, exactly, but he's held me underwater in our pool, pushed me downstairs, grabbed my arms hard enough to leave bruises. Once he locked me in our wine cellar for 18 hours because I smiled at a waiter. Lauren and Hank exchanged a look that Diane couldn't quite read. There's something you should know, Lauren said carefully. Preston Blackwell has a history. Before you, there was another wife, Brooke Winters. She supposedly died in a car accident 8 months after their divorce. Diane felt her blood turn to ice. What are you saying? I'm saying women who leave Preston Blackwell tend to have very bad accidents. Before Diane could respond, Hank's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and swore. The dealership's primary lender just called our floor plan loan. They want full repayment by end of business tomorrow, or they're seizing our entire inventory. That's impossible, Lauren said. You just refinanced last month. Preston owns shares in that bank. Diane's voice was hollow. He's starting already. Hank's phone buzzed again, then Lauren's. Then the house phone rang. Over the next 10 minutes, they discovered that Hank's dealership financing had been canceled. Lauren's hospital privileges were under review for unspecified complaints. Diane's mother, Ruth, had been fired from her nursing position after 30 years. He's going nuclear, Hank said quietly. Going after everyone who helped you. Diane stood abruptly, ignoring the dizziness. I have to go back. This was a mistake. If I apologize, if I make this right, maybe he'll stop. Diane, no. But her phone rang. Preston's face filled the screen. With shaking hands, she answered. Hello. Hello, darling. Preston's voice was smooth as silk. I trust you've had time to think about your behavior today. I've arranged for a car to pick you up. We'll discuss your concerning mental state at home. My mental state. Yes, the psychiatric evaluation I've scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. Dr. Harrison Blackwood is the finest psychiatrist in the state. He'll help you understand how pregnancy hormones have affected your judgment, how they've made you paranoid and unstable. Diane's hand instinctively moved to her belly. You can't force me into a psychiatric evaluation. Actually, I can have a court order signed an hour ago. Either you come home tonight, or tomorrow morning the police will escort you directly from that dealership to Mountain View Psychiatric Facility. My facility. Diane, where you'll stay until the doctors and I agree you're stable enough to safely deliver our baby. The line went dead. Diane looked at Hank and Lauren, seeing her own horror reflected in their faces. He's going to have me committed, she whispered. He's going to lock me away and take my baby. The hearing happened so fast Diane barely had time to process it. Judge Richardson, a silver-haired man whose campaign contributions from Blackwell Tech were a matter of public record, barely glanced at her before signing the emergency psychiatric hold. Dr. Blackwood, Preston's hand-picked psychiatrist, testified that Diane showed clear signs of postpartum psychosis despite not having given birth yet, that her accusations of domestic violence were paranoid delusions, that she posed a danger to herself and her unborn child. But I have witnesses, Diane pleaded. The security footage from the dealership, people saw him hit me. Mr. Blackwell has provided his own security footage, Judge Richardson said, examining papers Diane had never seen. Showing you stumbling and falling against the vehicle, he reached out to steady you, and you became hysterical. Pregnancy can affect perception. Miss Foster. It's Mrs. Blackwell, bow. Preston's attorney interjected smoothly. My client is deeply concerned for his wife's welfare, and that of their unborn child. Diane wanted to scream that she'd kept her maiden name, that Preston calling her Mrs. Blackwell was just another form of control, but the judge had already made his decision. Emergency 72-hour psychiatric hold approved. Mrs. Blackwell will be remanded to Mountain View Psychiatric Facility for evaluation and treatment. As the bailiff approached, Diane looked desperately toward the courtroom doors where Hank sat. Her cousin's face was a mask of impotent rage. Next to him, a woman Diane didn't recognize whispered urgently in his ear. Then everything happened at once. The woman stood, moving with the confident stride of someone used to courtrooms. Your Honor, I'm Ivy Caldwell, and I'm filing an emergency motion to represent Mrs. Foster in this matter. Judge Richardson frowned. This hearing is concluded. Counselor, with respect, Your Honor, it cannot be concluded when my client hasn't been properly represented. I'm also filing a motion to dismiss based on judicial bias. Your campaign finance records show over $200,000 in contributions from Blackwell Tech in the last election cycle. The judge's face reddened. Counselor, you're treading on very thin ice. Then let's talk about the ice your client is standing on. Mr. Blackwell, Ivy turned to Preston, her voice sharp as a blade. Tell the court about Brooke Winters. Preston's composure finally cracked. Just for a second, but Diane saw it. The flash of something dark and dangerous in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, but your first wife, the one who supposedly died in a convenient car accident 8 months after divorcing you. Except here's the interesting part. Ivy pulled out a folder. Brooke Winters is alive. She's been in federal witness protection for 18 months, and she's prepared to testify about a pattern of domestic violence, intimidation, and attempted murder. The courtroom erupted. Judge Richardson banged his gavel. Order, counselor. These are serious allegations. Do you have proof? I have sworn affidavits from federal agents. I have medical records documenting Mrs. Winters' injuries. And I have testimony from 3 other women who survived relationships with Preston Blackwell through FBI intervention. Diane felt the room spinning. Preston had done this before. Not once, but multiple times. How many women had he hurt? How many had he killed? Preston's attorney was on his feet. Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to derail legitimate mental health intervention. My client's previous marriage has no bearing on his current wife's psychiatric state. Actually, it has every bearing, Ivy shot back, because the pattern shows that Preston Blackwell uses psychiatric commitment as a tool of control. Brooke Winters was also involuntarily committed to Mountain View facility. She was held there for 6 weeks, forcibly medicated, and would have died there if federal agents hadn't extracted her. Judge Richardson looked genuinely shaken now. I'll need time to review these allegations. Mrs. Foster doesn't have time, Ivy pressed. Every minute she remains in her husband's control puts her life at risk. But it was too late. Preston's security team, private contractors who'd been waiting in the hallway, moved into the courtroom with practiced efficiency. They had badges, authorizations, all the proper paperwork. Your Honor, but Preston's attorney said smoothly. The 72-hour hold has been authorized. These officers are here to transport Mrs. Blackwell to the facility for her own safety while legal matters are resolved. Diane felt hands on her arms. Professional, gentle but unyielding. No, she said, her voice rising. Please, you don't understand. He's going to kill me. Ma'am, you need to calm down, one of the security officers said. We're here to help you. Hank, Diane screamed as they pulled her toward the side exit. Her cousin was on his feet, being restrained by bailiffs. Let her go. That's my cousin Diane. The last thing she saw before the door closed was Ivy Caldwell's face, determined and furious, already on her phone. Then she was in a white van with medical equipment and two stone-faced attendants. The doors locked with a heavy click. Through the tinted windows, she watched the courthouse fade away. One of the attendants, a woman with cold eyes, pulled out a syringe. This will help you relax, Mrs. Blackwell. Please, Diane begged. I'm pregnant. You can't. The needle slid into her arm with practiced ease. The last thought Diane had before the sedative pulled her under was that Preston had won. He'd always won. And now she would disappear just like Bro Winters almost had, just like all the others before her. The van drove on through the city, carrying her toward Mountain View Psychiatric Facility, toward Preston's complete control, toward what she was certain would be her death. Diane woke to stark white walls and the smell of industrial disinfectant. Her head felt stuffed with cotton, her thoughts moving like molasses. She tried to sit up and discovered restraints on her wrists. Ah, Mrs. Blackwell, you're awake. Dr. Harrison Blackwood stood at the foot of her bed, a tablet in his hands, his expression professionally sympathetic. He looked exactly like what he was, an expensive psychiatrist who catered to wealthy clients with inconvenient family members. Where am I? Diane's tongue felt thick in her mouth. Mountain View Psychiatric Facility. You're safe here. Your husband was very concerned about your mental state. I'm not mentally ill. Preston hit me. He's been abusing me for months. Dr. Blackwood made notes on his tablet with deliberate slowness, each tap of his stylus feeling like a nail in her coffin. Classic paranoid delusion associated with a pregnancy-induced psychosis. We'll start you on a treatment protocol immediately. No, Diane tried to focus through the fog in her brain. The sedative they'd given her in the van still clouded her thinking, made her words come out slurred. You can't give me psychiatric medication while I'm pregnant. It could hurt the baby. We have medications that are perfectly safe for expectant mothers. Your concern for the baby is admirable, but your mental health must be addressed first. His tone was patronizing, the voice of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused child. A nurse entered, carrying a small paper cup with pills. Diane recognized the woman from the van, the same cold eyes, the same mechanical efficiency. I won't take them, Diane said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. Then we'll administer them intravenously. One way or another. Mrs. Blackwell, you will receive the treatment you need. Diane realized with growing horror that she had no choices here, no autonomy, no rights. Preston had bought himself a prison where he could keep her drugged and compliant until he decided what to do with her. The room itself was designed for this purpose. She noticed details now that her vision was clearing the camera in the corner, the panic button positioned too far from the bed for a restrained patient to reach, the way the door locked from the outside only. Even the window showed nothing but another brick wall, no escape, no connection to the outside world. How many women had been in this exact room before her? How many had believed, as she once had, that Preston's wealth and power couldn't reach them here? Where's my phone? Diane asked suddenly. I have a right to call my family. Your husband felt it best if you focused on recovery without outside distractions. Family visitation will be evaluated after your initial stabilization period. Dr. Blackwood's clinical language couldn't mask what he was really saying. Preston had cut off all her communication with the outside world. You can't do this. There are laws. There are also court orders, Mrs. Blackwell, signed by Judge Richardson himself. Everything we're doing here is completely legal and in your best interest. The slight emphasis on your husband's friend hung unspoken in the air. The nurse moved toward her with the pills, but suddenly stopped, listening to something in her earpiece. Her expression shifted subtly, the first crack in her professional mask that Diane had seen. Dr. Blackwood, You're needed in administration immediately. The doctor frowned. I'm with a patient. It's urgent, sir. Federal agents are here with a court order. Diane's heart leaped with such force she felt it might burst from her chest. Ivy. It had to be Ivy. Or Hank. Someone had fought back fast enough to find her before Preston could make her disappear completely. Dr. Blackwood's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing calculation underneath. His eyes narrowed, and Diane saw him weighing options, considering strategies. Stay with Mrs. Blackwell, he instructed the nurse, his voice taking on a harder edge. Make sure she remains calm and secure. The moment he left, the silence in the room felt different. The nurse stood motionless, her hand still holding the cup of pills, but her posture had changed. She was listening to something on her earpiece, and Diane could see her making a decision. Then, to Diane's shock, the nurse moved to her bedside and quickly began unbuckling the restraints. What are you doing? Diane asked, almost afraid to believe what was happening. Saving your life. The nurse pulled off her cap, revealing dark hair shot through with gray, and eyes that held intelligence and determination rather than the cold emptiness Diane had seen before. My name is Tessa Clark. I've been working undercover in this facility for 6 months, documenting what Preston Blackwell does to the women he commits here. You're with the FBI, Corporate Fraud Division. We've been building a case against Preston for years. Money laundering, tax evasion, bribery, but we could never touch him until we had witnesses willing to testify about the personal crimes. When Tessa helped Diane sit up, her movements quick but gentle, mindful of the pregnancy. You're not the first woman he's had committed here. You're just the first one with family who fought back fast enough. Diane's mind raced, trying to process this sudden shift from despair to hope. Brooke Winters, Preston's first wife. Is she really alive? Very much so. And she's downstairs right now with a federal warrant for your immediate release. Tessa glanced at the door, then back to Diane with urgent intensity. But we need to move quickly. Dr. Blackwood will try to delay the agents, claim you're too unstable for transport, maybe even sedate you again before they can reach you. Diane swung her legs over the side of the bed, fighting through the lingering effects of the drugs in her system. Her body felt heavy, uncoordinated, but adrenaline was starting to burn through the chemical fog. Can you walk? Tessa asked. I can try. Diane stood, swaying slightly. Tessa steadied her. But before they could move toward the door, Tessa gripped her arm urgently, her expression grave. Listen to me carefully. The moment you leave this facility, Preston will escalate. He always does when he loses control. You need to be prepared for whatever comes next. What usually comes next? Tessa's expression was grim, and in her eyes, Diane saw the weight of knowledge of other women, other cases, other tragedies. Usually, the women die in accidents within 72 hours of leaving his control. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Diane had escaped one trap, but she was about to step into an even more dangerous game. And Preston Blackwell never lost. Brooke Winters looked nothing like Diane had imagined. She was petite, blonde, with the kind of delicate features that belonged in fashion magazines. But her blue eyes held a hardness that came from surviving something that should have killed her. They sat in a secure conference room at the FBI field office, surrounded by agents and case files. Ivy Caldwell was there, along with Hank and Warren, and leading the meeting was Special Agent Grant Walsh, a tall man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who'd seen too much. Mrs. Foster, Agent Walsh began, we need your help to end Preston Blackwell's criminal enterprise permanently. Diane looked around the room, still feeling the effects of the sedatives they'd given her at Mountain View. What kind of help? Brooke leaned forward. The kind where you wear a wire and get him to confess everything. He'll kill me. He's going to try to kill you anyway, Brooke said bluntly. The only question is whether we can stop him and put him away forever, or whether you become another obituary in his collection. Agent Walsh opened a file folder, revealing photographs. Young women, all beautiful, all dead. Maria Santos, age 26, found dead in her apartment, supposedly a home invasion. But nothing was stolen. She'd dated Preston for 8 months and tried to leave him. He placed another photo. Catherine Davis, age 31, died of sudden cardiac arrest despite no history of heart problems. She'd filed a restraining order against Preston 2 weeks earlier. More photos? More dead women? Jessica Palmer, Nicole Carter, Amber Rodriguez, Rachel Hayes. Agent Walsh's voice was flat, professional, but Diane could hear the anger underneath. All connected to Preston Blackwell, all dead within months of trying to leave him, all ruled accidental or natural causes because Preston is very good at making murder look like misfortune. 8 women, Diane whispered. He's killed 8 women. That we know of. Brooke's voice was hard. I'm number 9, except I survived because Agent Walsh's team extracted me the night before Preston planned to stage my car accident. They faked my death and put me in witness protection. Diane felt sick. Why didn't you testify against him then? We tried, Agent Walsh said. But Preston's lawyers are excellent. Without a body, without direct evidence of attempted murder, without witnesses willing to testify, we had nothing that would stick. He walked away clean and married you 6 months later. So you want me to be your bait? Diane's hand moved protectively to her belly. You want me to risk my life and my baby's life to catch him? We want to stop him from killing again, Ivy interjected. Diane, if you disappear, if you run, he'll just find someone else. Another woman who doesn't know what he is. Another victim who won't survive. Diane thought about those photographs. 8 dead women. 8 families destroyed. How many more would there be if Preston wasn't stopped? What would I have to do? Agent Walsh pulled out a device smaller than a button. Wear this wire during a meeting with Preston. Guide the conversation toward his threats, his past victims, anything that demonstrates his pattern of violence. He's too smart to confess on tape. You'd be surprised, Brooke said. Preston's greatest weakness is his ego. When he thinks he's won, when he believes he has complete control, he likes to explain exactly how clever he's been. He wants his victims to understand the full scope of his power before he destroys them. It's true, Tessa Clark added. She'd been quiet until now, but her voice carried the weight of months spent undercover. I've heard him on the phone with his lawyers, bragging about how he's outsmarted the system, how he's untouchable, given the right provocation. He'll tell you everything. Diane looked at each person in the room. They were asking her to gamble with her life. But if she said no, if she ran and hid, another woman would die, and another, and another. When she asked, tomorrow afternoon, Agent Walsh said, we'll arrange a meeting at neutral ground, somewhere public where we can have agents positioned as backup. The car dealership where this started would be perfect. Symbolic. Hank spoke for the first time. Absolutely not. I won't let my cousin be used as bait. It's not your choice, Diane said quietly. It's mine. She thought about Cole Bennett, the paramedic she'd briefly loved, the father of her baby. Cole had spent his life running toward danger to save others. He'd died trying to help someone during an emergency call. If she could honor his memory by stopping Preston from killing again, wasn't that worth the risk? I'll do it. Diane said, I'll wear the wire. Brooke smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. Then let's plan how to destroy the man who tried to destroy us. The wire was virtually undetectable. Agent Walsh demonstrated how it would transmit to receivers positioned throughout the dealership. Diane would have agents stationed as customers, salespeople, even security guards. Remember, Brooke coached her, Preston responds to weakness. If you go in strong, saying defiant, he'll be cautious. But if you seem broken, defeated, ready to submit, that's when his guard drops. That's when he needs to prove how much smarter he is than everyone else. They rehearsed scenarios late into the night, how to guide conversations, how to react to threats, how to signal if she felt unsafe. Through it all, Diane felt herself splitting into 2 people, the terrified pregnant woman who just wanted to survive, and the determined survivor who refused to let Preston win. Brooke walked her through specific phrases that had worked when she'd worn a wire years ago. When he starts feeling superior, that's when he talks. Ask him questions that make him feel clever. How did you plan this? I never saw it coming. Things that feed his ego. What if I freeze? Diane asked. What if I look at him and just can't speak? Then you don't speak. Tessa interjected. She joined them for the final briefing, still recovering from the Mountain View extraction. Silence can be just as effective. Let him fill it. Men like Preston hate silence. They need to control the narrative, explain themselves. prove their superiority. Ivy Caldwell reviewed the legal parameters one more time. Everything he says on that recording is admissible because you're wearing the wire with federal authorization. His lawyers will try to suppress it, claim entrapment, but we've covered every legal angle. At midnight, Hank pulled Diane aside. His face showed the strain of the past week, the assault on his business, the threats to his family, watching his cousin nearly disappear into Preston's control. You don't have to do this. Diane, we can disappear. New identities, new state, start over completely, and leave him free to hurt someone else. Diane shook her head. I can't live with that. Hank, I've spent 2 years living with fear. I won't spend the rest of my life living with guilt. Her cousin's jaw tightened. Then I'm coming with you tomorrow. If anything goes wrong. You can't. Preston knows you. Your presence would make him suspicious. Diane squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from years of working with cars, the familiar rough warmth that reminded her of childhood summers. But knowing you're watching from the surveillance van will help. Having family nearby always helps. Lauren appeared with warm tea, her practical nature asserting itself even in crisis. You should try to sleep. Tomorrow will be demanding, and you need to be sharp. But sleep felt impossible. Diane lay in the guest room, feeling hope move inside her, each flutter a reminder of what she was fighting for. This baby would never know her father, but she would grow up free from Preston's shadow. That had to be enough. The morning of the meeting, Diane stood in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing her defeated expression. She'd dressed carefully, a loose maternity dress that emphasized her pregnancy, minimal makeup that didn't hide the fading bruises, hair pulled back simply. She needed to look like a woman who'd been broken by 3 days in a psychiatric facility. Agent Walsh fitted the wire himself, his movements efficient and professional. His fingers worked with the practiced precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Yet Diane noticed the slight tremor when he tested the connection. Even federal agents weren't immune to the weight of what they were asking her to do. The moment you feel unsafe, touch your left earring, he reminded her. That's the abort signal. We come in immediately, operation over, and we take whatever evidence we've gotten to that point. What if it's not enough? Diane asked. Walsh met her eyes. Then we find another way. But we don't sacrifice your safety. Not for this case. Not for any case. Even if it means Preston walks free. Even then. His voice carried absolute conviction. Some victories aren't worth the taunt. Yan thought about the 8 women in those photographs, the families who'd never gotten justice, the future victims who would suffer if Preston remained free. This one is, she said quietly. Remember, at the first sign of physical violence, we move in. Don't try to be a hero. I'm not trying to be a hero, Diane said, touching the wire concealed beneath her dress. I'm trying to survive, and maybe, just maybe, make sure no one else has to go through what I went through. The drive to the dealership felt surreal. Through the tinted windows of the FBI van, Diane watched the city pass by. Normal people going about normal lives. A mother pushing a stroller, an elderly couple holding hands, a teenager on a skateboard. Did they know that somewhere in this city, women were being terrorized by men who believed wealth made them untouchable? She wondered if this might be the last time she saw it all. Preston had killed 8 women. What made her think she'd be different? But she had something the others hadn't. She knew what he was. She understood the game, and she had an army of federal agents ready to intervene. You're doing a brave thing, Agent Walsh said from the front seat, as if reading her thoughts. Whatever happens today, know that you're already a hero to a lot of people. At the dealership, everything looked deceptively normal. Customers browsed vehicles. Salespeople made small talk. But Diane recognized the subtle signs the man Tess driving an SUV was too alert, his eyes tracking every entrance. The woman examining a sedan spoke into her collar microphone between questions about financing. The maintenance worker cleaning windows moved with tactical precision that suggested military training. Preston's black Mercedes pulled into the parking lot at exactly 2 o'clock. Diane's hands trembled as she watched him emerge from the vehicle. He looked perfect, as always, tailored suit, confident stride, the very picture of success and power. To the casual observer, he was just a wealthy businessman meeting his wife. Only Diane knew the monster underneath. Agent Walsh's voice came through her hidden earpiece. We've got you covered. 12 agents in position. You're safe. But as Preston walked toward the dealership entrance, his eyes found Diane through the window, and the look on his face made her blood run cold. He knew, somehow, despite all their precautions, Preston knew this was a trap, and he was walking into it anyway. Preston entered the dealership like a king surveying his domain. His eyes swept the showroom, cataloging every detail, every person. Diane watched him calculate, assess, plan. Then his gaze locked on her and he smiled. It was the smile he'd given her on their first date. The smile that had made her believe in fairy tales and second chances. The smile that had hidden a killer. Diane, darling, he said, crossing to where she sat at the customer service desk. I'm so glad you agreed to meet. I've been worried sick. His performance was flawless. The concerned husband, the devoted partner. If she didn't know better, she might have believed it herself. Hello, Preston. She kept her voice soft, defeated. Thank you for coming. Of course, we need to discuss your treatment plan. Dr. Blackwood says you'll need another few weeks at Mountain View, but I convinced him to let us talk first. He pulled out a chair, sitting across from her with studied casualness. I know you've been confused lately, the pregnancy, the stress, but I'm here to help you through this. Diane forced herself to nod submissively. I've been thinking about what you said, about how I've been irrational, how the hormones have affected my judgment. Preston's eyes lit up with triumph. I'm glad you're starting to see reason. This whole situation has been unfortunate, but we can fix it. You just need to trust me. Like your first wife trusted you. The words were out before she could stop them. Not part of the plan, too confrontational. But she couldn't help herself. Preston's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. Brooke died in a tragic accident. Brooke is alive. Preston. She's in federal witness protection. She's told them everything. The silence that followed was deadly. Diane watched emotions flicker across Preston's face, shock, rage, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like respect. Well, he said softly, that is unexpected. Around them, the undercover agents tensed, ready to move. But Preston remained perfectly still, like a predator deciding whether to pounce or retreat. How much did she tell you, he asked. About the other women? About Maria and Catherine and Jessica? About how you stage accidents for anyone who tries to leave you? Diane's voice grew stronger. Everything. Preston. She told them everything. Preston leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. And yet here you are, meeting me without your FBI protection in sight. Either you're very brave or very stupid. They're here, Diane said. All around us. This conversation is being recorded. Everything you say will be used against you. She expected rage, violence, the loss of control she'd seen at the dealership 3 days ago. Instead, Preston laughed. Oh, Diane, sweet, naive Diane, do you really think a wire recording will matter? My legal team will have it suppressed before we reach trial. Illegal surveillance, entrapment, coercion of a mentally unstable witness. We'll have 20 different ways to make it inadmissible. You're admitting it. You're admitting you killed those women. I'm admitting nothing that will hold up in court. Preston's smile was cold. But since we're being honest, let me ask you something. The baby you're carrying, is it mine? Diane's hand moved protectively to her belly. I didn't think so, Preston continued. The timing never quite added up. I had my suspicions, but I was willing to overlook your indiscretion. A child, even one that isn't biologically mine, has value, heirs, legacy, the appearance of a perfect family. But now, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that the wire barely caught. Now you're just a problem to be solved. Like Brooke, like all the others who thought they could leave me. You're threatening to kill me. I'm explaining reality. Women who embarrass me publicly, who try to steal from me, who betray me with other men they have accidents, car crashes, home invasions, sudden illnesses that can't be traced. His smile widened. And their life insurance policies pay me millions of dollars, a small compensation for my emotional suffering. Diane felt sick. He was confessing everything, knowing it couldn't be used against him in court. knowing his lawyers would protect him, knowing he was untouchable. What about the baby? She forced herself to ask. What baby? Preston's voice was genuinely amused. There was no baby. Diane, you were never pregnant, just another delusion from an unstable woman who couldn't handle being married to a successful man. Very sad, very tragic. But these things happen. You'd kill your own child. It's not my child. You made that very clear. He stood, straightening his jacket. But don't worry. Your death will be quick and professional. The kind of service that costs extra but ensures there are never any questions asked. That was when Diane saw it. The slight shift in Preston's eyes. The calculation that said he'd given them exactly what they needed. He'd known about the wire from the beginning. He'd suspected the FBI presence. And he'd still walked into this trap and confessed to everything because he believed himself untouchable. That was his weakness. Not rage, not violence, but the absolute conviction that his money made him above the law. FBI, nobody move. Agent Walsh's voice echoed through the showroom as federal agents emerged from their cover positions. Customers revealed weapons. Salespeople showed badges. The maintenance worker pulled out handcuffs. Preston barely seemed surprised. Agent Walsh, always a pleasure. I assume you'll be calling my attorneys. Your attorneys can meet you at the federal courthouse. Walsh approached with practiced caution. Preston Blackwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and making terroristic threats. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Preston looked back at Diane one final time. This isn't over, he said quietly. Did you really think a recording would be enough to stop me? You have no idea what I'm capable of, what resources I have, what I've planned for every contingency. Diane felt a chill despite the agents surrounding her. Something about Preston's confidence, even now, terrified her. It's over. Preston, she said, trying to convince herself as much as him. His laugh was the last thing she heard as they led him away. It's just beginning. 3 hours after Preston's arrest, Diane sat in the FBI conference room, watching through one-way glass as agents processed evidence. She should have felt relief, triumph. Preston was in custody, charged with conspiracy to commit murder based on his recorded confession. Instead, she felt a growing sense of dread. Something's wrong, she said to Brooke, who sat beside her. He was too calm, too confident. He's a narcissist, Brooke replied. They always believe they'll escape consequences. But Diane couldn't shake the feeling that Preston had one more move to make. Agent Walsh entered the room, his expression grim. We have a problem. What kind of problem? Hank asked. He'd been pacing for the last hour, unable to sit still. Preston's legal team just informed us that he has what they're calling a kill switch. If anything happens to him, arrest, imprisonment, death. A secure server automatically uploads files to every major news organization and law enforcement agency in the country. Diane's stomach dropped. What kind of files? According to his lawyers, evidence implicating Diane in embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Fabricated evidence, obviously, but incredibly convincing. They claim it will prove that Diane was working with Cole Bennett to extort money from Preston, and when Cole died in that ambulance crash, she panicked and went to the FBI with false accusations. That's insane, Ivy Caldwell said. No one will believe it. Agent Walsh pulled up a computer screen. They might. Preston has been building this backup plan for months. Forged financial records showing Diane transferring money to offshore accounts. Fabricated emails between her and Cole discussing blackmail schemes. Edited audio recordings that make it sound like she's confessing to fraud. On the screen, Diane watched video that made her blood run cold. It was her, sitting in her home office, speaking into a camera. I've been stealing from Preston for months, her voice said clearly. Cole and I planned to take the money and disappear. But when he died, I needed a new plan. Accusing Preston of domestic violence seemed like the perfect cover. I never said that, Diane whispered. That's not real. Deep fake technology, Agent Walsh explained. Very sophisticated. Combined with Preston's financial resources and legal team, this could create reasonable doubt in any trial. Worse, it could result in charges against you. Brooke stood abruptly, her face pale. He did the same thing to me. Created fake evidence that I was embezzling from his companies. That's why I couldn't testify against him before. His lawyers would have destroyed my credibility and had me arrested for crimes I didn't commit. So what are our options? Hank demanded. Preston's lawyers are offering a deal, Agent Walsh said reluctantly. If we drop all charges, the kill switch never activates. Diane goes free, but so does Preston. The room erupted in protests, but Diane barely heard them. She was staring at the fabricated video of herself, understanding the full scope of Preston's planning. He'd known this day might come, had prepared for it, had built an escape route paved with lies so convincing that even she almost believed them. There has to be another way, Ivy said. We can prove the evidence is fabricated. Can we? Agent Walsh pulled up more files. Preston has been meticulous. Every fabricated document is backed by other fabricated documents. Every fake email has fake replies. He's created an entire alternative reality where Diane is the criminal and he's the victim. Diane thought about the 8 dead women in those photographs, about the countless others Preston would hurt if he walked free, about her unborn child, who would grow up in a world where their mother let a serial killer escape justice. No, she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. No deal. We don't drop the charges. We don't let him win. Diane, Hank started. If those files go public, you could face decades in prison. Then we find Preston's server before it uploads. Diane stood, moving to the computer. He's arrogant. He wouldn't trust this to complete automation. There has to be a way to disable it. Brooke joined her, studying the screen. When I was married to Preston, he kept everything important in a secure facility. Not at his house or office. Somewhere he thought no one would look. Where? Agent Walsh asked. The Mountain View Psychiatric Facility, Brooke said slowly. Specifically in the basement server room. He owns the building, has complete control over access. It's the perfect place to hide illegal data. Agent Walsh was already on his phone, coordinating teams. We can get a warrant for the facility, but it will take time. And the moment Preston realizes we're searching Mountain View, he might trigger the upload manually. Then we don't tell him. Diane's mind was racing now, seeing the pattern. Tessa Clark, she's still undercover at the facility. She can access the server room. And do what? Walsh asked. Even if she finds the servers, she's not a tech specialist. She can't just delete files without triggering alarms. But Diane was remembering something Preston had said months ago when he'd been drunk and boastful. Preston told me once that he keeps master passwords written down. She said, he doesn't trust digital storage for something that important. Said a piece of paper in a secure location was safer than any encryption. Where would he keep it? Ivy asked. Diane closed her eyes, picturing Preston's study, the wall safe behind the fake bookshelf, the desk drawer with the false bottom, his medical files, she said suddenly. At Mountain View, Dr. Blackwood keeps patient files in locked cabinets. Preston has his own file there, supposedly for his anxiety treatment, but I saw him put papers in it once. Important papers he didn't want at home. Agent Walsh nodded slowly. So we need Tessa to access both Preston's medical file and the server room, find the password, and disable the kill switch, all without anyone at the facility realizing what she's doing. Can she do it? Hank asked. She's a federal agent who's been undercover for 6 months in a psychiatric facility run by a serial killer. Brooke said, if anyone can do it, it's Tessa. But as they began planning the operation, Diane couldn't shake one final fear. Preston had planned for everything else. What if he'd planned for this too? Tessa Clark moved through Mountain View's corridors with the practiced ease of someone who'd worked there for months. To the night shift staff, she was just Nurse Clark, doing rounds, checking on patients. None of them knew she was about to commit federal crimes to stop a serial killer. Dr. Blackwood's office was on the 3rd floor, locked but accessible with the master key Tessa had borrowed from administration. Inside, patient files lined the walls in neat rows. Preston Blackwell's file was exactly where Diane said it would be. Tessa pulled it out, flipping through medical records that were obviously fake, treatment notes for anxiety that Preston had never had, prescription records for medications he'd never taken, and then, tucked in the back, A single sheet of paper covered in Preston's precise handwriting, passwords, account numbers, server locations, everything she needed. Find what you're looking for, Nurse Clark. Tessa spun around to find Dr. Blackwood standing in the doorway. His expression was professionally neutral, but his eyes held calculation. I was just, Tessa started. Please, I'm not stupid. Blackwood stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. I've known you were FBI for 3 months. Did you really think Preston wouldn't have me watching for exactly this kind of infiltration? Tessa's hand moved toward her concealed weapon, but Blackwood raised his hands. I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to help. Why would you help me? You're Preston's man. I was Preston's man. Blackwood's voice was tired, until I realized what he was really doing with the women he had committed here. The forced medications, the falsified diagnoses, the way they would arrive healthy and leave broken, or not leave at all. He pulled out his phone, showing Tessa photographs of medical records. Women who'd been held at Mountain View, treated with dangerous medication combinations, released into Preston's custody, and died within weeks. I'm a doctor, Blackwood said quietly. I took an oath to do no harm. What I've done here, what I've helped Preston do, it violates everything I became a physician to uphold. Tessa studied him, looking for deception, but saw only genuine regret. If you're serious about helping, I need access to the basement server room. Blackwood pulled out a key card. Take this, and take this. He handed her a flash drive. It contains copies of every patient file from the last 5 years, every woman Preston had committed, every falsified diagnosis I wrote, every medication protocol I prescribed, full documentation of his crimes and my complicity. You'll go to prison for this, Tessa said, taking the items. I know, but maybe I can salvage some small piece of my soul by ensuring he goes to prison too. The server room was cold, filled with the hum of expensive equipment. Tessa found Preston's private servers exactly where the passwords indicated. She worked quickly, bypassing security protocols, accessing the kill switch program. It was elegant in its simplicity. If Preston didn't check in every 12 hours with a specific code, the servers would automatically upload gigabytes of fabricated evidence to preset destinations. The next scheduled upload was in 43 minutes. Tessa inserted the flash drive and began downloading everything. Not just the kill switch program, but all of Preston's files, his real financial records, his communications with hired criminals, his detailed plans for each woman he'd targeted. She was so focused on the download that she almost didn't hear the door open behind her. Step away from the servers. Tessa turned to find Preston's head of security, a man named Marcus Steele, pointing a gun at her. Behind him stood 2 more private contractors. FBI, Tessa said, raising her hand slowly. You're interfering with a federal investigation. FBI agent operating without a warrant, Steele countered. Breaking and entering. Theft of private property. Mr. Blackwell was very clear about what to do if anyone tried to access these servers. The gun didn't waver. Tessa calculated her options. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and 42 minutes away from Preston's evidence going public. You kill a federal agent, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, she said. Only if they find your body. Steele replied, Mountain View has an excellent crematorium. Very thorough, very discreet. The download was at 92%. Tessa needed 30 more seconds. Preston's already under arrest. She tried. You're loyal to a man who's going to prison anyway. Mr. Blackwell pays very well for loyalty, and he has friends who will ensure certain files never see a courtroom. Steele's finger moved to the trigger. Last chance. Step away from the servers. Tessa looked at the screen. 96%. She'd spent 6 months undercover to reach this moment. Had risked everything to stop Preston Blackwell. She wasn't going to fail now. No, she said. Steele's expression didn't change as he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the server room like thunder. The bullet never hit Tessa. Dr. Blackwood, who'd followed her to the server room, threw himself between her and the gun. The impact spun him around, blood spreading across his white coat. Download complete. The computer chimed. Tessa yanked the flash drive free and dove behind a server rack as Steele's men opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off metal and shattered equipment. But Tessa was a trained federal agent, and she'd been in worse situations during her career. She returned fire with the weapon she'd concealed. Taking down one contractor with a shot to the leg, the other retreated, calling for backup on his radio. Steele advanced, professional and calm. "You've got nowhere to go. Agent Clark, even if you make it out of this room, you'll never leave the building." But Tessa was already on her phone. "This is Agent Clark. I've got the evidence and I'm under fire at Mountain View. Send everything." 20 seconds later, she heard it. The beautiful sound of federal agents storming the building. Shouts of FBI and "down on the ground" echoed through the corridors. Steele hesitated, then lowered his weapon. "Mr. Blackwell doesn't pay me enough to shoot it out with the FBI." As agents flooded the server room, Tessa knelt beside Dr. Blackwood. He was still breathing. Barely. "Did you get it?" he whispered. "Every file, every crime, every victim." Tessa gripped his hand. "You did the right thing." "Too little, too late," Blackwood coughed, blood on his lips. "But maybe it counts for something. It counts for everything," Tessa assured him as paramedics arrived. Later, in the FBI conference room, Diane watched as Agent Walsh displayed the contents of Tessa's flash drive on multiple screens. Financial records proving Preston's money laundering, communications showing his conspiracy to commit murder, medical files documenting his systematic abuse of vulnerable women, and most damning of all, the kill switch program itself, complete with the fabricated evidence against Diane and detailed instructions for its deployment. "This changes everything," Ivy Caldwell said, reviewing the legal implications. "Not only do we have proof of Preston's crimes, we have proof of his attempt to frame Diane. Any jury will see through his defense now." Preston's arraignment happened the next morning. His lawyers, usually so confident, seemed deflated as prosecutors presented the evidence. The judge, after reviewing the files, denied bail entirely. "Mr. Blackwell, you are accused of conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, attempted murder of a federal agent, and operating a criminal enterprise. Given the overwhelming evidence and your demonstrated flight risk, you will be remanded to federal custody pending trial." Preston's mask of control finally shattered. "This is a mistake. You can't do this. Do you have any idea who I am, what I'm capable of?" "I know exactly what you're capable of," the judge said coldly, "which is why you'll await trial in a maximum security facility." As marshals led Preston away in handcuffs, he looked back at Diane one final time. But instead of the terrified, controlled woman he'd married, he saw someone who had found the courage to fight back. The trial, 3 months later, lasted only 4 days. Preston's lawyers tried at everything, claiming entrapment, challenging evidence, attacking witness credibility. But the files from Mountain View, combined with Brooks' testimony, Tessa's undercover recordings, and Diane's own harrowing account, painted an undeniable picture. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of a federal agent, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of operating a criminal enterprise, we find the defendant guilty." Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a benediction. Preston showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 60 years on the remaining charges. "Mr. Blackwell," the judge said, "you used your wealth and power to terrorize, abuse, and murder vulnerable women. You corrupted institutions meant to help people and turned them into instruments of control. The sentence of this court ensures you will never harm anyone again." As marshals escorted Preston from the courtroom for the final time, he didn't look back. 6 months later, Diane stood in the nursery she'd decorated in her new apartment, holding her daughter. She'd named her Hope, because that's what the last year had been about. Hope that justice could prevail. Hope that courage could overcome fear. Hope that love was stronger than control. The apartment was modest, nothing like Preston's mansion, but it was hers. Paid for with settlement money from Preston's seized assets. Money that also funded the foundation she'd created with Brooke to help domestic violence survivors. Hank had recovered from his injuries and reopened the dealership. Ruth's memory was honored in the foundation's name. Lauren had delivered Hope when Diane went into labor. ensuring the baby came into the world surrounded by people who loved them both. And Cole Bennett, the paramedic who'd loved Diane briefly but genuinely, lived on in his daughter's kind eyes and gentle spirit. Diane's phone buzzed with a message from Tessa. The agent had become a friend over the months of testimony and trial. Dr. Blackwood died this morning. Liver failure from his injuries. His last act was donating his entire estate to the foundation. Said it was penance for the women he'd helped Preston hurt. Diane typed back, he found redemption in the end. That counts for something. Another message arrived, this one from Brooke. Support group tonight. New member needs help escaping a controlling partner. Reminded me of us. Diane looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the war that had been fought to ensure her safety. Not tonight, Diane replied, but tomorrow, always tomorrow. Because that was the thing about surviving what she'd survived. It created an obligation to help others survive too, to turn pain into purpose, to ensure that Preston's victims, the 8 women who'd died and the countless others who'd suffered, had not done so in vain. Outside her window, Denver sprawled in evening light, somewhere in a maximum security prison. Preston Blackwell sat in a cell, his wealth and power stripped away, facing the rest of his life behind bars, and here in a modest apartment filled with love instead of fear. Diane Foster held her daughter and understood something profound. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Sometimes family means the people who show up when you need them most. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice prevails. Hope stirred in her arms, opening her eyes to look up at her mother with absolute trust. The kind of trust that Preston had tried to destroy, but had ultimately failed to break. Diane smiled, kissed her daughter's forehead, and whispered the words she'd learned to believe again. We're safe now. We're free. And we're going to be okay. For the first time in years, she knew it was true.